Hello, I'm Chris. I'm a drag performer, artist, musician, general creative person. I'm also a trans man, and this summer just gone, it was exactly 20 years since I first came out as trans. So I thought it would be nice to mark that by making a video where I talk about my experiences over that time and talk about my transition. And I thought I would put on some drag makeup while I do it, just so that you can have something to look at. And I think, people have been interested to see my makeup process, so I thought that would be a nice thing to do. I'm not going to talk much about the makeup as I do it, because then we'll be here all day. But I'm going to do a look which I did for the Trans Pride in Bristol a couple of years ago. So I have my trans flag flower crown here. So I thought that would be appropriate considering. So yeah, it's been 20 years since I first came out as trans. It was just before my 16th birthday when I first came out, which, at the time was pretty unusual. I didn't know anyone else at the time who was that young who had come out as trans. I think I sort of, had an idea of being kind of different, as we often do. But the first time I remember really being aware of it, I must have been about 7 or 8. And I have this very vivid memory of having seen, it was probably something like Trisha, one of these daytime talk shows. And they had a whole panel of trans women talking about their lives and talking about being trans, and it was very sympathetic. It was a little bit like, oh, these poor people, their lives are so hard, but for the time, having that kind of supportive representation of trans people was very unusual. So yeah, and I just have a really vivid memory of having seen that and sort of thinking about it and thinking, oh, they must be able to do that the other way, surely. I'm going to do that when I grow up. So obviously I was, transed by that show, whatever it was. Yeah, so I think I basically just pushed a lot of stuff to the back of my mind. So I was kind of aware of it, but didn't kind of allow myself to think about it. I was very conscious of how I was supposed to behave and what was expected of me. I mean, I was never particularly my parents never sort of stopped me doing what I wanted to do, and I was never particularly a tomboy anyway. I've got a big sister who I thought was great and wanted to copy with everything. So, and I was never particularly into sport or anything like that. But at the same time, I think I was very conscious that I had this kind of, expectation on me, and that it wasn't the done thing to try and challenge that at all. I ended up coming out as a lesbian when I was 13, which again, was young to do that. And this was still during Section 28 times, but I don't have any particular memory of that really stopping me or really making me think that I shouldn't come out. When I was 12, my mum passed away. Because at the moment, obviously, there's all this stuff about rapid onset gender dysphoria. If that had been a thing when I was that age, I would definitely have been accused of it, because I was going through some pretty heavy stuff, and the way that it kind of appeared to people around me is that it just totally came out of nowhere. My experience of being trans never really came from feeling particularly boyish or masculine, or wanting to do boy things. It came much more from a more sort of physical dysphoria and, the desire to have a male body. So it seemed to the people around me that there was no, it wasn't like I was always like refusing to wear dresses or like, wanting to present in a very masculine way when I was younger. I think when you have bad things kind of layering up, or what I found anyway, when I had like bad things layering up, like something needed to change. When it was kind of just like one bad thing, I could sort of deal with it. But when it was something else, I needed to make the shift and, and come out and make a change in my life. It was just before my 16th birthday in that summer when I first came out, or not necessarily first came out, when I first realised in myself. Like I said, this was the year 2000, so the internet was kind of just becoming a thing. I was discovering all these GeoCities websites as they were talking about, trans people talking about their experiences. It's kind of hard to imagine it now that these experiences were very difficult to find, and very difficult to meet other trans people, or to even like hear other trans people talking about their experiences. So yeah, I definitely feel like I was kind of part of that first generation who was really able to experience that and really able to connect with other trans people. Because when I did start like meeting and connecting with other trans people, most of them, so I was, still in my kind of like late teens at this point, kind of 16, 17, and most of the people were like at least in their late 20s, like mostly in their 30s, and these were people who, like other trans people who were just coming out. But yeah, so I kind of joined like these Yahoo groups and met other trans people that way, and then I had the memory of going to my first ever trans support group, which was in this tower block in the middle of, I grew up in Leeds, and it was a tower block in the middle of the city centre. And I'm guessing it was some like community space, like some kind of charity. But I went in there and it was this really like sterile, kind of quite corporate feeling space. And there was this group, probably about like 6 or 7 people who were all trans women, all kind of at least in their like kind of in their 40s and 50s. And so I was there as this like, teenage trans guy, who, I mean, obviously it's, it's great to meet other trans people regardless, but I just didn't feel like I really had anything in common with any of these people. And then as well, so when we all came in, we all sat in this circle and just sat there, like everyone was kind of too like nervous to talk, because a lot of these people, we were all like very early in our transition and very very kind of unsure about, and for a lot of people there, I think it was the first time they'd ever knowingly been in the same room as another trans person. And for some reason, the people who were facilitating it, rather than actually facilitating it, just like sat there as well. But yeah, it was very odd. But after being in some of these online groups, these online social groups, I'd kind of started talking to a few local trans guys. So, we were I was mentioning about this support group, which seemed to be the only one in the city at the time, at least the only one we could find. And so there was one session when a few other trans guys came along, and there was this moment where, after this weird thing of everyone kind of awkwardly sitting around, like a couple of them just stood up and said, "We're going to the pub, who wants to come?" And all the trans men in the room got up and followed them out, and we all went to the pub. And that started this trans masculine, trans man support group, which, well, like a social group really, that met in the pub every month. Which, was a much more relaxed atmosphere. We could kind of like get to know each other like as friends, rather than, that obviously there is something to be said for having these sorts of things in very closed spaces, but at the same time, the way it was, we could kind of like get to know each other and then have the more kind of personal conversations like in our own time. And yeah, so there's been a lot of changes in the sort of general ideas about trans identity, because at the time the only experience that I had of of what it was to be trans and of how people talked about being trans was an extremely transmedicalist attitude, and an extremely, like, you know, in this group I was in, it was very like, oh, we're men, we do manly things, we're like, you know, we do these things as manly men because we're men, and very like a sort of very set idea about what transition was and what you would kind of go through as a trans person. And, you know, like this very transmedicalist, like, you know, you go on hormones, then you have chest surgery, then you have a hysterectomy thing. And it was even to the point where, like, I've always been way more into spirits than pints, but I would always get a pint when we went to the meeting because I was like, that's what we do. When, you know, it was like, it didn't, expressing something that wasn't this idea about how men are supposed to behave was, I mean, maybe it would have been fine, but it definitely felt like it would have been kind of sticking my neck out a bit. And like, as a, you know, as a young, like, teenager, that was not something I felt I could do at the time. I mean, as all this was going on, I also ended up going to a school that so before this, I'd been at this like huge comprehensive school, which was quite like, you know, diverse in the kind of people that were there. And yeah, quite sort of, you know, most of the people I was with were quite sort of liberal, open-minded, lots of weirdos, so we could all hang out and be weirdos together. But then I ended up at a private Methodist boarding school in Harrogate for my GCSE years, and I was fucking miserable there. I had no friends. Well, that's not true. I had a couple of friends, and then other people told me that I should stop hanging out with them because they were a couple and I was apparently, like, you know, jamming their vibe or whatever. So I stopped hanging out with those people because I was told not to. Yeah, you know, talking about this kind of stacking up of like shit thing on shit thing. You know, I was also in this environment where I just didn't relate to any of the people around me, and people who, yeah, were just very into being like, trying to be like normal or trying to be kind of trendy, and I just wasn't used to that. I was like used to people enjoying being weirdos and enjoying being freaks, so I like really struggled there. Yeah, but at the same time it also like enhanced this idea, I think, for some around me that I was like doing it because, you know, it's like I was also really struggling to, you know, I was clever but struggling to actually like get my work done, and struggling to like get my homework done and things like that, which, you know, I was depressed. I was a depressed queer teenager, but that was never really like considered as a possibility. You know, I'd come out as trans when I was in this very unfriendly environment, and then I ended up moving back to the school I was at before for my A-levels, which, yeah, was really great. I remember my music teacher, when I was doing my A-levels, she could obviously tell that there was something wrong with me, and I think this was even in like the first month that I was there, and I think it was very clear to her that there was something up with me. So she kept me back after one of our classes and kind of sat me down, and it was like very clear with the way she was talking to me that she was not going to let me leave until I like told her what the problem was. And so, you know, when I told her I was trans, she started telling me about a trans timpani player that she used to know, which was pretty cool. The difference between the way I was treated in the two schools was like night and day. Like instantly they were changing all the names on my registers, changing all the the name. Or straight away they were changing my name on all the registers. All the teachers started referring to me using male pronouns and started using Chris, the name I was going by. Like at the time, it was just like, oh yeah, that's, you know, they're doing that. But now looking back, and bearing in mind this was either while Section 28 was still going or it had just finished. Looking back now, it's really impressive how supportive they were, and how good they were with it. Pretty much as soon as I realized that I was trans, I kind of knew it was like everything kind of came together very quickly for me. I knew what I wanted. I knew I wanted to go on hormones. I knew that, which, you know, looking back now, I'm a bit like, was that, like, how much of that was that was the process that I was shown? As I said, there was this very kind of trans med vibe going around. You know, I went to my doctor pretty much as soon as I realised I was trans, to be referred to the gender clinic. And it was the Leeds clinic that I was referred to. But I was on that list for 2.5 years at the time, before I ended up going private. Like, I discovered that there was a guy called Reid who was kind of the guy to go to if you were trans. And yeah, he basically like prescribed me testosterone after one appointment. You know, it was such a great thing to be able to do that. After my A-levels, I did an art foundation course and then went to uni. And it was during my art foundation course that I started on hormones, which worked really well because, you know, it was this kind of like transitional year for me anyway. And it meant that by the time I started at university, I was completely, like, within a few months, I was like passing as male all the time, like without question. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I said everything was very sort of trans medical at the time. I think for me, my experience of gender dysphoria is very much, was at least, you know, I don't experience it anymore, but was very much a physical thing. Before I started testosterone, I basically felt prepubescent. Like, I felt like I hadn't gone through this process that all the guys around me were. Like, I didn't look in the mirror and think I look like a woman. I thought I look like a prepubescent boy. Yeah, and in terms of, you know, my chest, like, I was big. Like, I never really bound my chest that tightly, just because I could bind it to the point where I was struggling to breathe, and I still very clearly, you know, had boobs. Before I had my chest surgery, it always felt like they'd kind of just appeared, and it would always like be slightly surprising to see them there. And then, like, as soon as I had them off, it was just like now it seems weird to think that I ever had boobs. It just feels so normal and natural for me to have, you know, a flat chest. Once I started on testosterone, that was like really great for me. It basically kind of leveled me out emotionally. You know, I think I had a lot of kind of, it's not really like anger, but very kind of internalized anger. And then as soon as I started taking testosterone, like, that just went completely. And I was a lot more just calmer and able to kind of like deal emotionally with existing a lot better. In the summer after my foundation course, I ended up going to this festival called Queeruption, which is basically this like massive 10-day long queer squat festival in Amsterdam. It was basically hosted in a different city every year for, I think there was about 10 of them, and they were hosted in different cities around the world. But, you know, I didn't know anyone when I went to it. I just sort of, someone had told me that I would like it. And I was like, oh, I don't really know. I don't really like sort of gay things. Because, you know, my experience of the gay scene was this extremely, like, like very normative, very like, oh, we're being all cool and trendy, and like everyone has to look the same and be the same vibe, which just didn't appeal to me in the slightest. So my friend told me I should go to it, and so I kind of took a chance, and it just completely like blew my mind open. For the first time I was encountering people who were like doing their gender in different ways, and people who like had these different models of gender that they were working with, and different like approaches to gender. The idea that you could be trans and not medically transition had like never occurred to me, and had never been like presented to me as an option before then. And it completely blew my mind. There was less of a sort of boundary between being queer and being trans. To be queer was kind of to be inherently like non-binary. Like the term non-binary wasn't really used that much, or at least I don't remember it being used. But to be queer was kind of to be non-binary, because it was all about dismantling like oppressive gender binaries and other binaries, and creating new spaces that weren't about the binary. So that was pretty great. And I mean, I was very involved at like this whole queer, like anarcho queer scene became like a huge part of my life for many years. And these kind of politics, I mean it still is, but like this very specific kind of anarcho queer scene that was going on at that time, kind of queer squat scene. I said that like the other place I was at was very transmedicalist. One issue with this other scene, the anarcho queer scene, is that it could kind of be the opposite, but not the opposite of transmedicalist, in a sort of like bodily autonomy, everyone can do what they want with their own body kind of way, but in a sort of gender and sex are different things. The way your body is doesn't have to determine your gender. Therefore, if you change your body or medically transition, then you're upholding oppressive patriarchal binary standards, which luckily the people I was like friends with on the scene like didn't buy into this, but I definitely like encountered people who had this, and encountered people who like had an issue with me because I was on hormones. People who didn't know me, who like were like, oh, you're bad, you're like buying into this oppressive system because you're doing what you want with your own body, which is pretty fucked up, really. It was very much this retaliation to this extremely transmed like vibe around the scene. One thing that was positive that came out of it, I ended up not having chest surgery, for being given the space to be like, I don't have to have chest surgery right now. It kind of really allowed me to like sit in that space, and I'd experienced so many changes with the testosterone that I just didn't feel like I particularly needed it. And I was kind of happy with the changes that I was experiencing. I eventually reached a point where like my desire to not have boobs like overrode my fear of surgery, basically. That wasn't for a while, and it was really, I think it was really important for me to have that time and have that space. I do remember going back to the group I'd been in, the like the trans man social group, and saying, I can't remember like how exactly it came up in conversation, but I like said to the group like, oh yeah, I've kind of decided I'm not going to have chest surgery, or at least not have it for now. And there was just this like shocked look around the group, and everyone was just like staring at me open mouthed, and one guy was like, so you're going to have breasts? And I was like, well, I guess so. if I'm not having them removed. It was really interesting to see those kind of worlds colliding, of this like very normative trans circle I was in versus these kind of, radical queer politics colliding in this space. And then I ended up actually getting into the Leeds gender identity clinic and getting an appointment with them. It was so useless. Seriously, I'd already been on hormones for about a year at this point. I just felt like they were talking to me as if I was like thick, basically, and like not talking to me like I was an actual person. And I mean, the only reason I was going was because at that point I wasn't entirely sure whether I wanted chest surgery or not. I was like, I can't be honest with them, because if I tell them that I'm not sure if I want surgery, then if I decide that I do, it's going to be harder for me to get it. I'd mentioned queer theory to them and all this stuff, and it's like, it was and still is like such a big part of how I understand myself and how I understand my relationship to gender in general. I felt like they couldn't really like understand where I was coming from without that, and they had no clue. They didn't know anything about it, and I was a bit like, surely if your job is working with trans people, like, do you not want to like understand these things? When I was 25, I decided that I wanted to have a hysterectomy, and a big part of this was because, now I know that there's a lot of it's not totally clear, the sort of medical things, but at the time what I was hearing was that if you were on hormones for a long time, like, and didn't have a hysterectomy, it could like cause damage. So I decided to have a hysterectomy. So I assumed that like I would need to go via the gender clinic again. So I went to my doctor. Instead of referring me to the gender clinic, referred me straight to the gynecology unit. And yeah, like I went to this meeting, or this appointment, expecting to like have to do the whole therapy thing and like really justify myself as trans and like basically be diagnosed as trans again. And I basically turned up there and they were like, so we can either do it like this or this, and we've booked in this date in like a month's time for you. I'm like, okay, I'd quite like to do it after Christmas actually. But yeah, so it was like, it was very easy, like very surprisingly easy. As people who weren't specialists in trans stuff, they basically were just like, does this person have a good reason to have a hysterectomy? And according, as far as they were concerned, it was a good enough reason. And they just did it. And like, it was, pretty amazing to kind of be able to like do that with so little fuss. I mean, even when I had my initial diagnosis, like, I was able to kind of get it without much fuss as well. Because I was able to pay for a private session, which, is how it should be, surely. Yeah, so I had it I had it just after Christmas. It's funny, all my surgeries I've had, and all, both trans and non-trans, and like all my kind of medical things, I've always had them just after Christmas. Like even like my first shot of testosterone was on like January the 3rd or something. I think is a very good time to have surgery, because like no one really wants to do anything anyway. It's one of the great things about being a man in the gynecology unit. Like, they gave me my own room, which was very nice. Yeah, and I was treated pretty well. Got given very disgusting food because I was vegan at the time, and they apparently don't know how to cook vegan food. But yeah, it all went very well and was a very good experience generally. Getting my chest surgery was a much bigger palaver. So I had some inheritance money that I wanted to use to pay for it. The private surgeon I was using wouldn't, needed a diagnosis letter. And because, and it had to be from certain people. So because my diagnosis had been such a long time before, I needed to get a new diagnosis. So my initial plan was to get the diagnosis through the NHS and then, or get a referral rather through the NHS. But I ended up, a similar thing. I got referred to the NHS and I still haven't heard back from them. This was in 2013. Well, actually a couple of years before that, because that's when I actually had the surgery, that I was referred, and they just never got back to me. I had my sort of initial assessment, because they I don't know if they still do, but they used to do a kind of a scan to check, basically to see if you had any undiagnosed mental health stuff. I had that, and then I just had nothing after that, basically. Just heard nothing at all. So I ended up going private for my referral as well, which, was a bit of a palaver, really. So I ended up going to this clinic where, in order to get this referral, I needed to have 3 appointments, all of which cost over 150 quid. And the first one was literally about 40 minutes long, less than that, probably about half an hour. And it was just the most pointless thing. I'd been on hormones for years. I'd already had a hysterectomy. I was probably, if I was doing it now when I'm a bit older and a bit more bolshy, I would go through some sort of, there was probably a way of doing it that I didn't have to go through that whole thing. That was how it was presented as what I needed to do at the time. So that's what I did. It definitely felt as if I was just being ripped off. The person who led the clinic was trans, so you'd think that but I think it was just this thing of wanting to really go by the rules. I think that's a big part of why they did it. But anyway, I eventually managed to get this bloody referral. So I had it in Brighton with Dr. Yelland, and I'm really pleased with it. It was a very, it was at a private hospital, so it was quite nice, and I felt treated really well, and I'm really pleased with the results that we ended up with. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the differences between how I think the trans scene is now versus, not the trans scene, how I think being trans now is compared to how it was back in my day. I think obviously there's been such a change in the amount of visibility, and I think that accessing medical transition has always been really hard and has always been a real challenge to it. Obviously these days, it's balancing out visibility versus backlash, because back in those days there was a lot less abuse in the papers, but at the same time there was also a lot less support, and it was a lot harder to find other trans people, and it was a lot harder to find any kind of representation. It feels like there's been the change, like I say, going from being this extremely invisible group who weren't being catered to because people just didn't know about us, or didn't know about us beyond things like Ace Ventura, what's it called, Silence of the Lambs. That's all people knew about us. They didn't know anything about our health needs, or our actual lived realities. Whereas now, obviously there's a bit more awareness of that, and so we've kind of now got this shift to this very like explicit backlash to trans people existing and, you know, needing healthcare and needing, you know, wanting to just sort of exist and live our lives. I don't think it's really possible to say that like one is any easier than the other. I mean, obviously, like I say, it's hard to know because I'm not like transitioning in the current environment, but like, yeah, like I say, when I came out, it was basically unheard of for someone as young as I was to come out, whereas now, like, you know, I remember a couple of years back I was on a trans Facebook group and there was someone saying, like, they were like 14 and they were saying, oh, I know it's a bit late for me to be coming out as trans, and it's like, dude, like, what? You know, and you know, the fact that we don't have like section 28 anymore is obviously such a huge change. People can have like support groups in schools. I mean, yeah, you know, there's a lot of backlash to like queer people learning about themselves in schools, but you know, at least it's legal now. At least it's something that can legally happen. Yeah, and I also think it's really fantastic how, you know, like I say, things were very transmed at the time. And I think it's really fantastic how, like, the sort of more, like, I mean, obviously, like, transmedicalism is still a thing, and there's still transmedicalists about, but, like, they're the outliers. Like, they're not the people who are kind of defining the terms of transness. It's pretty amazing that that's happened in that time. I'm also really glad that the whole like, oh, don't medically transition because it's like upholding the patriarchy doesn't seem to exist anymore. Like I've not encountered anyone who has that attitude for years, which is fantastic. I'm aware now that even at that time and before then, there were like a lot of people who were challenging the kind of transmedicalism in a more body autonomy focused way. But like I said, it was just so hard to find the information then. It was so hard to, like, unless you were in the right place at the right time or you found the right books and managed to like speak to the right people, you just didn't have the information. Yeah, so what I was able to access and, you know, the ideas I was able to find were just what was, you know, on these GeoCities websites and these very like, you know, kind of what I'm doing now a little bit, these very like, oh, this is my transition story, this is my origin story, you know, like when I was a child I always played with cars, and, you know, I always knew I was really a boy, I always wanted to, you know, wear these things, and it was, you know, this very like, you know, standard narrative, which obviously like is true for people. I'm not saying that like it's not a real thing, but it was all that there was, and it was all that I was able to see. Do you know, I haven't done any makeup for maybe like 5 months, so I kind of forgotten everything that I do. Do you know what it needs? The one makeup tip I will say, just put fucking glitter on everything. It just makes everything work if you just glitter it. The other tip, always use biodegradable glitter. That way when you get these like clouds of glitter dust like I'm getting now, you can rest assured that it's fine. I think that seems to be it. You can't quite see all my... I have to sort of stoop and it can sort of blend. This wasn't planned, but I can sort of like look like a kind of trans like forest being emerging out of the tree. Thank you very much for watching. You know, it's nice that you got this far, got through it. I'm glad that I got through it. We got through it together. If there's anything I talked about that you want to hear more about, or, you know, if you want to hear more about my experiences with the drag scene or with the, you know, with performance in general, I might talk about that sometime. But yeah, let us know what you think. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram. Yeah, thank you very much. Goodbye.